all of the owners tending to act like shareholders. So nobody driving or leading the business. What happens is the business is run by expert managers. They go to whichever parent they need to get the answer they want. And the passivity just shows up in really poor business performance. And most of those doctors in that group are focused on their own personal exertion income.
Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I'm here today with Todd. Hey, Todd.
Morning, Sachin.
Today, we're talking about multi-owners and multi-owner groups and how we might structure and go about leading that and organizing the work, especially when there's different appetites amongst the team for taking on that work, and how we might consider it and how we might put it into action and play in a really useful way. So, Todd, we might just get straight into it. Maybe we'll start with what we commonly see as common scenarios when there are multi-owner groups. And multi-owner groups might be 2, it might be 7. But what are the common sort of problems or difficulties or challenges that those groups will experience, or that you've seen in your time dealing with hundreds of practices across the country?
Yeah, in coaching, that's the breadth of what we're seeing, 2 to 7. I've worked with groups up to 9 owners in the past as well. And the common symptoms of this are all of the owners tending to act like shareholders. So nobody driving or leading the business. And then because there's kind of abdication of all of the leadership functions, any of the visionary functions in the business, what happens is the business is run by expert managers. And then those expert managers tend to behave a little bit like kids with dysfunctional families. They go to whichever parent they need to get the answer they want. And there's kind of these quarterly meetings that are just complaint fests, asking about what my distribution is, which often isn't very much. In the larger groups I've spoken to, most commonly they have a profitability of very close to 0, if not 0. And the passivity just shows up in really poor business performance. And most of those doctors in that group are focused on their own personal exertion income. So their focus is on themselves, never really on the more broad group setting. And certainly none of them have a structure that enables them to take time off the work they're doing for themselves, the personal exertion income, to work for the betterment of all. So if I was to sort of pick a classic of this, and there was one that I went to with my corporate hat on, Sachin, which was fantastic. I could tell by the floor plan who had designed the floor plan. I could tell it was designed by the practice managers, because I kid you not, 60% of the floor plan was for office space and admin services, and 40% was for general practice services. I didn't even have to go and look at the spreadsheet to know what was going on in this place. I've never seen a clinic that had so much space allocated to admin work. Unsurprisingly, these guys weren't making any money and had staffing overheads of kind of 30 to 40% of billings, and wondered why that wasn't working. Now, that's a really extreme case, but you'll usually see higher than normal ratios of admin and nursing staff. And you often have roles that you're like, what is that role? So there's, I remember one place had like a nurse greeting role. So their job was to be a fully qualified nurse and say hi to patients that were coming into the treatment room, like the person standing out the front of the hotel without the income and budget of a hotel. And so you do end up with all these really strange roles, a lot of friends being employed. It's a little bit more like a family than a business, low performance metrics, very unclear or absent standards, people coming in late, people leaving early, people running. The business serves their lives rather than them all being there to serve the business and the community more broadly, which is ultimately why a practice exists. And then there's kind of the quarterly distribution thing is just like a whinge fest. All the doctors get together. Typically the owners are doctors. Occasionally they've roped in an admin person thinking that would improve the performance. But the passivity is the problem. And so these businesses often have really long reputations locally. So there might be 20, 30-year plus clinics. A really good medicine is often produced in these clinics, but poor collaboration. So if people transition between clinicians, that's often not good. And in terms of the appropriate structures, leadership, management, accountabilities, all of those things are poor. And they just rely on the PM having that knowledge pre installed. And if it isn't installed, there's no way for them to get any extra support or knowledge because that's not included in any budget. And so these businesses are often large opportunities that are squandered, and something has to happen to shake them up usually.
Cool. And so that's what the owners may experience in terms of performance and what we may see from the staff side. What sort of dynamics might we see amongst the ownership group? Like, so if there's two, maybe there's five, maybe there's seven, there'll be some different things that play in those groups. What are the types of situations that commonly occur in those settings?
So, Sachin, I think they range from highly active to highly passive, and then most of them sit somewhere in between those two. So people might have nominal roles. You know, there might be somebody who's kind of a medical director role, but because it's not actually compensated or even measured on a scorecard, there's no active performance metrics for any of the team, and so the directors doing these roles are also not specifically measured in any way their performance, and so what happens is it sort of starts out as a goodwill thing where that person thinks, well, I know this needs to be done. I'm not the type of person to stand by the wayside and watch things go poorly. And then they do it usually at a high standard at the start. And then because of a lack of appreciation or acknowledgement, let alone compensation, often interest and engagement in that role wanes over time. And then I see the sort of silent resentment that builds up between the partnership because of asymmetrical efforts, and they're often at different times. So the older doctors have been through this cycle, done the work, not received compensation or appreciation. In fact, often that means they sacrifice their personal income for the betterment of the good. They do that for a period of time, thinking it's the right thing to do. Then they slowly withdraw, thinking, you know what, it doesn't matter if I do it or not because I don't get any benefit. And then they come out the other side as a bit, I'm not doing that again kind of vibe. And then the new people come in and go through the same experience. So there's kind of people in various grades of frustration and burnout, but they respect their colleagues as clinicians. They just don't respect them as business owners, as co-owners of the business. And so the quarterly catch up and distribution stuff can be a bit of a shit show, you know, where people are often outwardly hostile to people. Sometimes there's a lot of decorum, but there's frustration and misalignment that's very shallow under the surface. And so those teams are highly dysfunctional when they're like that. And I've seen that many times. Good people that just don't work together because they don't really have a shared understanding of any part of the business, really. They kind of all have very different ideas. And so these people are often running businesses blind from any data. They'll get the BAS data, the accounting data that comes on a quarterly basis. That meeting is often held 6 weeks to possibly even 12 weeks after the end of the quarter. So, you know, it's really old information that people are measuring on. They certainly don't use the metrics that we recommend, you know, daily cash flow, weekly summaries and monthly P&Ls. Like they're not doing any of that kind of stuff. You discover what's going on every quarter. And not everybody would come to that meeting. Some people would just think, look, I'll just take the money and I'm just going to enjoy dinner with my family. So they're really uncomfortable environments in most cases. And if you're one of the doctors there that's still young and enthusiastic, or maybe you haven't lost your enthusiasm, it is very frustrating for you because you're trying to motivate grown ass adults into doing the right thing. And it's just very difficult because the structure doesn't permit it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that sense of frustration or sense of being weighed down, like we're weighed down by these people who don't want to move. And I know I can see the opportunity, I can't move. It's interesting you talk about the resentment. I remember in, one of my early partnerships, we were actually both growth focused and wanted to grow and were growing fast, but we didn't have enough conversations and clarity about our roles. So there was some duplication and overlap. We were both working hard, both clinically and non-clinically. And I remember it must have been a Wednesday afternoon, and I'd seen a bunch of patients, and my partner at the time had a few health assessments and some chronic disease stuff in there. And I remember speaking to him resentfully that, oh, you're doing all these high value items and I'm seeing all the patients. Just stupid shit, just stupid stuff.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, and that was in an aligned partnership. And so that's just amplified, or worse still, rots the place from underneath. without being surfaced. And so, yeah, that was just an example that I had and I personally felt during that time. We kept growing and we improved the way we went about things, but certainly in our early days, I experienced that without any doubt and shared that. And I'm no doubt he would have felt the same as well in other ways and thought he was doing the bulk of the work when in fact we just didn't have clear structure.
Yeah, I think that's also common where you've got, and that's typically what you see with smaller groups where people do see somebody working, so they want to get in and help. And then, as you say, because of poorly defined roles, there's a lot of overlap. And then when there's a lot of overlap, what happens is you'll both be giving different direction to, the same person, the PM, and it becomes really hard to do those leadership roles, whether it's the head of the nursing department, a head of admin, or the PM. And so they start to take direction from different people. It becomes really difficult for them to take action that is aligned with all of the different direction given to them. And again, what you tend to see is that over time we just start to retreat with our effort because the misaligned effort, you're literally rowing different ways. And so all of the effort makes very little progress. So you sort of don't have a linear result between effort and result, which is normal for us with our personal exertion income. It's normal for us with our academic career up to that point in time. We're kind of used to this linear relationship: more work, get a better outcome. And so that does start to frustrate people and burn them out somewhat. And so in terms of the frameworks for that, Satchel, we'll have a little bit of a chat about it. But I'm going to ask you, did you solve that? Do you feel as if you got to a point where that was rectified?
Yeah, for us, it was when we started spending more time together. And the way we did it is, we started business coaching with a local business coach, Nick the coach, is still around. And what that did is it created a space for us to align ourselves around action and a place where we could, yes, we had tools and coaching, etc., but it also allowed a structural change of being together and having time allocated for it, which meant we could decide exactly what needed to be done and who was doing what. And that was the probably a key part of simplification and improving the way we went about working together and making us way more effective. But yeah, it's just really interesting when I look back. It's a bit embarrassing, sharing that, I remember having that conversation. I can replay the video in my head and, I'm glad that I solved it. But there's so many immaturities that I had, and obviously I still have, we're always working on ourselves, but there were a lot of immaturities I had at that time, and just lack of perception of what others were doing around me because I was just so busy and so determined, yet so busy. It was just really interesting. But it was that space and that structural change where we actually carved out time that we were committed to, and then spent that time working together on the business. And that's something I never then retreated from in future business partnerships.
Yeah.
I would say.
And I think, Sachin, one of the things that happens is when you run an immature business, and we ourselves are immature, which we must be at the start, we don't have the knowledge and understanding of what we're doing. What happens is there tends to be a paucity of data. And so therefore, we're really debating feelings and whose feelings have primacy. And it's not a very sophisticated game, but we all resort to that when we're frustrated and working hard. And there are trade-offs, particularly early on in business. This is typically a time you've got a young family, you've got other means, you've often got high debts to service. So there's a lot of other that are inside your head that you want to get right. So I think it's pretty normal to have this kind of circumstance, and also, without the space to create intentional alignment and the wisdom, because we don't have that experience yet. It's normal for relationships to go through these phases. And again, this is the same thing is true of personal relationships as business relationships. They go through that kind of messy stage where you're trying to figure it all out, understand preferences, understand superpowers. What are people really good at? What are they good at but hate doing? Sometimes those things are really tough. And you see someone doing something to a high degree of proficiency, and you're like, "But Sachin, you're really good at that." And no one's ever said, "Do you like it?" You're like, "Yeah, but I fucking hate it." So these sort of conversations are really important as part of business. And I've never sat back to have a look at how many businesses I've set up in life, but it's a lot. It's probably 20 plus. And so you do get better, each time you do these things. How about you? Have you ever sat back and looked at how many businesses you've set up? I know it's a lot for you too.
Yeah. Thankfully, mostly successful and some abject failures along the way. I think it would be 11, yeah, along the way. But there's nothing like learning in the arena. I've done a business degree. They don't teach you that stuff in a lecture hall and presenting to a group of other students. All right. So we've talked about what people might experience, the challenges, both how it shows up in the business and how it might show up personally or in the ownership dynamics. We're here to provide solutions. How should people think about solving this? And there are different ways people might think about it. There's probably some mistakes as well they can make when they're trying to solve for this. So they maybe have the right intention. Yeah, I want to solve this. And then they may take a erroneous pathway as well. So what are the ways to go about solving this? And where's the quicksand to avoid? And then we might talk about some examples where we've seen it work well.
Absolutely. I reckon one small detour, with your permission, I'm going to make just into the PM role. And the reason I want to highlight the PM role is I want to give a shout out to PMs that are in this situation at the moment, or have managed it. It's extremely difficult because you can't get solid guidance. You don't have a regular relationship with a single director typically. And the challenge is that kind of everything is left in your hands, which may be not what you've asked for. And so that often includes financial accountabilities for moving money, doing the bookkeeping, managing the strategy, managing the execution of strategy. All of it often has to come from the PM, somebody who's really poorly supported in that role. And so what PMs often do is kind of adapt to it by dealing with the most useful advisor or director that they can get a hold of to get an agreement. But they know that it's not wise to try and get everyone in the room because you often can't get alignment, let alone agreement on anything. And so it can be a really, really frustrating and difficult role as a PM. I strongly encourage these PMs to have a chat to their owners about potentially restructuring or changing this, because as you alluded to earlier, Sachin, the latent potential in these businesses is enormous, but somebody has got to go in and grasp the opportunity and move forward with it. So this does come back to that description we've used before: nice people, no money, where you can have a bunch of really good doctors that have a great local reputation, but high degree of misalignment at leadership level. Pretty well everybody is abdicating their responsibilities and just letting the PM do whatever they want. And so there's a large degree of mission drift over often decades. And so there's a lot of corrective work that needs to be done in these. I think the first thing, Sachin, if we move to the solution, there has to be a general consensus that things can be better around here. You've got to find a common point of agreement. I remember listening to a speech by Barack Obama, and he was saying that doesn't matter what kind of conversation he's having around negotiation, what he's first searching for is a common point of agreement. And what his tenet was that if you cannot find that, you really can't move forward in any way. So I think the first thing is the owners have to at least agree that there's a way forward. And if things are really acrimonious, then they probably should have alignment coaching to actually make sure that there is a structured approach to getting people on the same page and moving forwards, at least being better than where they started. In terms of structurally, sometimes they do need to tend to the legal structure, the vehicle that holds the business. And I would strongly recommend speaking to an accountant that is an expert in the area if you think that's a problem. So the types of things that are a problem here are if you're compensated on the basis of your earnings within the ownership structure, that is probably an issue. So your compensation for personal exertion income for technical skills of being a GP should be on the same basis as every other GP in the practice, independent GPs, tenant doctors, contractors, whatever you want to call them. You should be engaging on the same basis. So when you work more, you get paid more in that environment. That's fine, but that should not flow through to the way the ownership structure works. So if you've got a partnership structure or some weird thing in there, then we strongly recommend that you have a chat to an accountant. Two that we like in this area, that there's a lot we like, but two that we recommend: Kelly Chartered Growth MD, Paul Copeland, and William Buck, because those guys know the sector really well. They're going to know what you should be thinking about moving towards. So if you've got a structure that impedes progress, then you should be attending to that first of all. And then, Sachin, I think it's important to understand the five hats of the owner. And so the first hat is as a director. You do have directorial responsibility. That includes the fiduciary slash financial responsibility and governance. Those are really important as part of that role. And so you don't get a chance to abdicate those. You can't just say, well, I don't care. I'm not doing those things. Those are your responsibilities via ASIC. And so you must adhere to those. Most directors in general practice, like small to medium enterprises, aren't compensated for that role, and that's okay. The compensation should be profits that go to your family trust or whatever structure that goes to. The second one is the creator, and the hat of the creator is one that is not usually always switched on. But for example, if you have say you're opening a new telehealth business and somebody needs to engineer the workflows, the processes, then that would be a part of that role. If there's some new process that's started from the GP perspective, at least there's going to need to be something engineered. And sometimes this is things like, documents in best practice, etc. It might be helping setting up an AI scribe, like Lyrebird or Heidi or something like that. Then there's the executive hat. And so this is if you've got a formal role in the accountability chart. The most common one would probably be the medical director. This should be matched with a scorecard, and it should have some kind of compensation attached to it, even if it's not paid. And we can talk about that in a moment. But this person has leadership, management, and accountability as part of that executive role, and they would be scored on it by others. How well are they discharging those duties? One of them is the role of the technician, the GP. And so, as I said, that should just be through a regular service and facility agreement, same as any other GP, and ideally on the same compensation. There's a trap here where some directors get paid a higher retention, so they get to retain a higher portion of their earnings by having a lower service and facility fee. The thinking from the other directors is this will compensate them for the amount of time they spend doing non-consulting things. I'm going to throw to you, Sachin. What's the problem with that before I get to the last one? What happens when you do that? So say the standard agreement is 65% GP retention. Sachin, you're going to be the medical director, and that means you're going to run monthly meetings with the clinical team. You're going to onboard and you're going to look after all of the GP registrars. If there are any IMGs, it's your accountability to look after those. And in return for that, I'm going to give you a 70% retention. I'm going to drop the service and facility fee to 30%. Why is that a bad deal for you?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense because you're incentivizing the wrong behavior, because you're incentivizing seeing more patients. But what you want is for them, or me in this case, to spend more time doing the leadership work and the management work of that group of people you just mentioned. And so when I'm doing that, I'm not earning anything. And so it would make sense that in my head, I should be seeing more patients because I'll earn more if I see more patients. Yes, theoretically, what it should mean is you see less patients, and for those you receive a larger proportion of the billings to compensate for that time, but it actually doesn't make sense together. So it should just be separated out and recognized financially in some other way. Whether you choose to pay it or not, it actually needs to be accounted for differently.
Yeah, one really interesting thing I think, Sachin, with this is old ownership structures were obsessed about full-time, usually dudes, working their backside off 50, 60 hours a week. But actually the best people to have as owners are part-time because they have time to do these other roles and they should be compensated appropriately. I mean, if you're really good at taking on GP registrars, onboarding them, retaining them, that is a massive value to the long-term value of the business, massive contribution to the long-term value of the business. And so these should be compensated appropriately because they are really, really high value, particularly if your role is anything to do with GP retention or recruitment. That is one of the key skills for the business to hold and to make sure that they can deliver at a really high level reliably. The last hat, Sachin, is the hat of the investor. Now, people often neglect this hat. The reality is you can do other things with your money and time. And in a lot of cases, I've met doctors that have done things for 20 years that I think, fuck, you would have been way better off just putting money in an index fund, working 10 less hours a week, or splitting it, working 5 more hours consulting, putting that in your index fund, the other 5 hours with your family, and just not wasting your time on pretending to own a business because you never leaned into adding value or extracting value from that business. And so the question for the investor is always, as it should be if you're investing in any other investments, should be what's the return on my time and money? And that is a really important thing to be looking at. So now that we understand the hats, we now need to understand the different approaches people can take to kind of knocking over the objectives and achieving the potential that's latent in the clinic. One thing that people want to do often is to sell the practice and kind of extract what value they believe it should be from somebody else. What often happens, and I had a couple of these conversations when I was at the corporate, I'd sit down with these people and say, I've got some bad news for you. And I'd say, yes, what's that? I'd say, well, the business actually doesn't make any money. I'd say, yes, yes, we know that, but it needs to be turned over to this. You're like, well, you can't receive a premium for work that you should have done. So therefore the business will transact it at its current value. And most people were shocked to hear this, but that would be like saying, oh, I've got a house and somebody can build multi-story apartments on there, but I want to be paid as if that's already built. You're like, well, you know, you got to work, you got to do the planning, you got to start getting permits. This is the same thing here. I think people need to make, if they want to unlock value, they're going to make some of these changes early on. And so the choices available to people really early on, it might be clear that there are some people that aren't up for it. And so often in this case, there's 1 or 2 doctors that are kind of a year or so away from retirement. And I would suggest that one of the earliest things you do, depending on what your shareholders agreement is like, you may wish to tidy up the register. So you might want to just actually start to buy out some of the owners that are not enthused about doing the work, which is fine. If you've got appropriate buy and sell mechanisms in the agreement, usually those are advantageous and are usually substantially cheaper than what you could get externally. So the fix up becomes really valuable. And I strongly believe that the doctors involved in fixing the business up should be the ones who get the return, not the person who's kind of sat there for 20 years and done nothing about it, unless they're prepared to take some action. And so, therefore, you got 3 different possibilities. One is that you all sell. One is that you are a buyer of other people that sell within the entity. Or one other option I think should always be a valid option is that you are selling, and that just frees up your cognitive space and your choice that you can go and start your own business or start one with one other person that you know you're highly aligned with. And certainly the session from Nerida talks about that, where she exited for $1 just on the basis that she could restart and has built something of immense value that she herself was able to create. So that's another possibility. You know, I think the sunk cost fallacy of time and money is an issue where people think, I've bought into this thing, I can't leave. So giving yourself freedom to either buy, sell, or everybody sell is a valid thing. The problem about everybody selling to an external body is you probably have a 3-year commitment to continuing to work there. And then you'll have a 5-year restraint, usually within a relatively large radius, as to where you can't work. That's okay if you're planning on moving or traveling somewhere else. But it's also good if you're going to plan to stay there and that you want to continue to run a business or own another business nearby. The choices, though, Sachin, are really 2 of them: divide and conquer or have the chosen one. And so let's talk about the chosen one first. The chosen one is you and I get together and we go, Sachin, you are by far the best looking, the smartest of the 2 of us. We choose you to lead. And then you go and take responsibility for those hats and do more of that. Now, a lot of large businesses actually do have this kind of structure. So you look at Intel, Google, Oracle, a lot of these businesses, Microsoft, there's typically someone who's the front person who does all of the presenting publicly. And the other person is more of a silent investor. And so, you know, that's okay, provided that person is compensated for that work. That's a reasonable approach to take. If the business obviously has no money, then there's got to be some commitment to paying for work that isn't yet delivered. And this is a healthy structure. I think being paid for work that's been done is a really useful dynamic because you're likely to get a better outcome when there's real money changing hands and everybody's committed. So that's one strategy that you could deploy. The other one, and this is often what's done when there isn't much or any profit, is divide and conquer. So we say, okay, Sachin, you look like you're going to be best with managing the nursing team and the admin team. I'll look after the doctors. I'll do GP recruitment and I'll take on the GP registrars. And I'm going to be the supervisor / mentor for those. And we would divide and conquer in that way. Again, that's also reasonable. I think the main thing for people to keep an eye on here is having appropriate scorecards and performance metrics. What does good look like? And making sure that you're regularly meeting up to discuss your performance, each of your performance. And those are probably the two main ways that people might do it. I don't mind what people do because my preference is that this is something that I quite like, is that the ducklings don't line up until the duck starts moving. So we want somebody to start to take forward action, motion, because overcoming static friction is the hardest. Getting those first few steps going is the thing that is frustrating and difficult. As you start moving, you're going to find some people in your team don't like it. The fact that you're starting to demand more of people, have actual standards, ask them to report, have actual data, and starting to shine the light on underperformers, saying, actually, I'm not quite sure what you're doing here. These are your roles. These aren't being done. You're going to see people start leaving in that environment. And that's a great thing. Those are the people that should be leaving because they've been passengers on the bus the whole time that you were sitting on the bus as a passenger as well. So I think that's probably where people look to. And then, Sachin, if you like, we chat a bit about what kind of meeting structures hold the whole thing together, if you like.
Yeah. So I think so just to check the messaging there, the options are: one, pick one person to lead and get out of that person's way. If it doesn't interest you, if you're a fellow owner, you want the business to succeed, you're happy for the business to succeed, then you have to go to work and pick that person that's going to do the job and make sure they are paid for doing that work. So that's one option. Or if you don't want to be involved, or you don't want the business to improve, or you don't want to be involved in that journey, then sell it to someone who does. But don't impede the potential of that business, because that's what you're doing and it harms you and it harms those around you, because it actually detracts from the ongoing value of that business. Separate to that, another option is that if there's a group of you that are willing to lead, then clearly define the roles that each of you will play, how you will measure the success of those roles, and then have a way of having regular discussions to check in on performance of the roles and also capacity, because sometimes your estimation of what a role is may be quite different to what it actually is. And so that needs recalibration. Cool. We might do the meetings. I think we'll do a separate podcast around ownership meetings. But I reckon that the question in people's minds, whether they're listening or watching, will be, what should they get paid for doing this? What should someone who then has this leadership role get paid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer is that everybody sits down and commercially works out what's the price that somebody would say yes to the work. And this is the issue, is sometimes the person doing the work may have a higher opinion of what that's worth than the person who's funding the work. I think, like all things, Sachin, sometimes we let perfect get in the way of better. So if this is a new thing, then often what we need to do is set an agreement that kind of works for everybody at the start. And then, as you say, there are just regular recalibration meetings to say, how's it working for you? And then as the funder on the other side, the question is, how's it working for you? You just need to see progress, really, that things are improving and measurably so. But this is like taking over a team that is probably towards the bottom half of the ladder in any sport. Progress can be slow at the start, and then it tends to be really quickly. There's probably three people I can think of that we've worked with, and I won't use their full names, but they start with B, S, and A, that have done this in between 4 and 7 in the largest case owners. All were women, and it's a small sample size. I'm not sure if that is kind of common or if it's just what we observed. But these people were able to turn around businesses valued at, I'm going to say in most cases, close to zero, that the actual business profitability was not there. And so these businesses were ones that would have transacted at a price because there's always a replacement value and somebody can extract the future value. Uh, but but Sachin, these businesses were worth at the low end $2 million, and then at the high end up to $5 million in terms of the business valuation from my recollection. I'm really curious about what your recollection of those three owners that stood into. So just to be clear, these all did the chosen one, right? They all did the single person that was effectively a managing director that stepped into the role. All really talented people, excellent with leading others, and really passionate, driven people, and took the role seriously. What's your recollection of what they got the business values to?
Yeah, one of them started at about 275 of profit and got it to about 800,000 of profit over 18 months of work. Really worked hard. And actually, in that situation, that person wasn't compensated for that. And there was then an issue with the underlying resentment and lack of appreciation for that effort.
So just pause on that for the enterprise value. So that's probably made a difference in enterprise value of between 1.2 to around $4 million. And so that person, through their own personal effort, created $2.8 million of enterprise value from their own personal labor for no reward. And so just talk a little bit about the consequence of that. I'm just going to say disrespect.
Yeah, well, it actually held the practice back from further growth ahead, and it baked in resentment in the practice, and I think long term makes that partnership untenable.
It'll
Because
drift
of
back, right?
yeah, it won't continue because it relied on that person's effort. Actually, if that person had been compensated, they would have continued doing that and driving.
How much would you pay that person to do that? Like, say they're spending 10 hours a week doing that. What would you pay them to extract that amount of value?
Yeah, well, I have an idea of a number that I think's reasonable, but even if you just work off that result, so they've gone from 275 to 800,000. So they've added $525,000 a year of profit, right, through their efforts. If you said the average person should, even if they just generated 1 to 1, like that, then that much extra profit, above, so double their salary, then you'd be talking 150 to 200 there. But we're talking here, this person put in a day's work a week, roughly a day to a day and a half. The way I would be thinking about it is just make sure they're not losing out, at least from their clinical income. So what's their clinical income for the equivalent work? And just make sure that's taken care of. I think when we discussed it with this person, that's all they wanted. Just make sure I'm not losing out when I'm putting in the work to grow the business. Do that, then everyone wins, because that person doesn't lose for switching from general practice work to the leading work, and everyone wins because the profit comes out the other end. So that's the way I would be thinking about it. It would be somewhere between 150 and 250 an hour for that type of work. And as you said, if you just regularly calibrated it to see how it was working for the business, how it was working for the individual and for the other co-owners, then that's a reasonable process. You can allocate a 3-month agreement, amend it after that, run for another 3 months, and then you reach a steady state, I think. That's the way I'd think about it. How about you?
Yeah, I think in my mind, I think 100 grand a year would be where I'd be starting. $2,000 a week, roughly, for which would be about right for a day. And again, that person's going to feel like they're winning from that. That's substantial enough that it's going to make a difference to their life at home. They're not losing out of it, and everybody can benefit from that. I think this is a really good demonstration of how a lack of appreciation from the other partners will just put everything back to the base state. So we haven't checked back. I've every confidence that that business has probably resorted to a much lower profitability where everybody loses, and there was an opportunity for everybody to win, but the scarcity mindset of some of the other owners wasn't able to recognize the opportunity there. The reality is good people cost money. And so you need to appreciate them with money. If you try and nickel and dime stuff, try and under pitch the financial compensation, you're just going to get people resenting it over time, and as you say, withdrawing their services. And worse still, even if they withdraw services, they just have that resentment that lingers, and usually those partnerships blow up. at some point in time, people are going to leave. And usually the ones who leave are the good ones. So the ones that are left behind are the passive ones. And they don't really know what's going on anyway. So that's a really good example of what can be unlocked. And as you said, that job was probably only 60% done. So that they could easily have got to somewhere between 1 and 1.2 mil, potentially have a business that's worth somewhere around $6 to $9 million. And that's all been squandered, and the business is really more like $1 to $2 million. That's an incredible damage to the value of the business.
Absolutely. So I think we're probably given a good overview there. Takeaways. If you were going to say, what were 3 things that people who are in a multi-owner group should do based on this episode, what would you say that would be?
Number one, I think you've got to recognize if this is you. If you're listening to this episode and you're nodding your head, then it's you. Number two, you need to sit down with your other owners and ask them if they're feeling the same way. Just do a pulse check and alignment check. If everybody's on board with improving things, they've had enough, then you choose whether you go chosen one or divide and conquer. And the last thing, the little asterisk here, is just check that you have no structural impediment to doing this. And that may involve either chatting to your own accountant or getting a second opinion for one of the ones mentioned earlier.
Perfect. We'll put the links for a couple of those episodes we mentioned earlier in the show notes. Todd, that's been awesome. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Go have that conversation. If something has resonated with you from what we've shared today, then it means you need to have that conversation before it becomes something bigger. So that's the main thing. If you've twigged, that sounds like something I'm experiencing, seeing, or feeling, then you need to probably share this episode and then have a conversation. I've been Sachin. He's been Todd. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.